Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I want to start by welcoming the decisive action announced by our new Prime Minister to halt rising energy bills. This vital support will save families £1,000 on their bills, on top of the £37 billion of help that's already been announced. And I'm sure the whole Chamber will welcome the measures from the UK Government to support people and businesses across the country right now. First Minister, yesterday your government announced £560 million of cuts. The cost of living crisis means difficult decisions for governments all over the country. But do you now regret that so much money was wasted on ferries that haven't been built, a scandal that so far cost taxpayers £250 million when that money could have been used to address the cost of living crisis?
First Minister.
Firstly, Presiding Officer, can I also take the opportunity to welcome the very belated action on energy bills that the new Prime Minister has just announced in the House of Commons. I've not yet seen all of the detail, but I am aware of the headline. But while I welcome it, can we also be very clear, Presiding Officer, it does not represent a halt to the rise in energy bills. Average energy bills right now are just under £2,000. A cap of £2,500 will still see people pay more for their energy. And of course, if we go back to the spring of this year, average energy bills were around £1,200. So people are seeing soaring energy costs because of a broken energy market and the utter incompetence of this UK government. And lastly on that issue, as things stand, all of the costs of what has been announced today are going to fall on consumers and taxpayers, when oil and gas companies making windfall profits should be making a contribution. So I think we can see whose side the UK government is on today. Secondly, Presiding Officer, yes, the Deputy First Minister outlined savings that are having to be made in the Scottish Government's budget this year. Let me remind the purpose of those savings. Firstly, so that we can ensure that public sector workers get the fairest possible pay rises. And secondly, that we continue to target resources to those who need them most in this cost of living crisis. So that is the backdrop, a budget this year that, because of inflation, is worth £1.7 billion less than it was when we published it. So the other thing we need to see the new Prime Minister do is increase funding for devolved administration so we can support public services and public sector workers. And lastly, Presiding Officer, no, I don't regret the actions this government took to save Ferguson's shipyard and to ensure that those working there still have a job. That is important. And of course, we will continue to take action to ensure that the two ferries are completed and that work continues.
Well, there we have it. It's official. Nicola Sturgeon doesn't regret wasting £250 million of taxpayers' money when that money is needed right now to help our services. Because if her government hadn't wasted £250 million trying and failing to build ferries, that money could have been used elsewhere in the SNP's budget. These failures leave islanders without lifeline services, and they take money away from the frontline spending we need here in Scotland. We know that nearly £50 million of emergency COVID support went to fix these ferries instead of going to the businesses who needed it. An internal analysis by the ferry operator CMAL has indicated that the number and the severity of the issues and faults with these ships means that it will be, to quote them, difficult for the vessels to achieve acceptance by CMAL and enter into service. So what plans does the First Minister have in place if, as the experts fear may be the case, these vessels never become fit to sail and more money needs to be diverted away from the cost of living crisis to make up for these failures?
First Minister.
Firstly, Presiding Officer, what Douglas Ross has just said about COVID money being directed to Ferguson's is simply not true, and he should, I think, take the opportunity to reflect on that and withdraw that. That misunderstanding came from the name of a particular budget line. It did not reflect how money had been allocated, and I believe Although if I'm wrong on this, media sources have already corrected that, so perhaps Douglas Ross wants to reflect further on that. Secondly, on the issues around ferries, I have made clear on many occasions my regret at the cost overrun of that. That is why it is so important we continue to focus on completing the ferries. But even if we took Douglas Ross at his word about £250 million, which of course wouldn't be in 1 year, that would still leave the rest of the £1.7 billion that her budget has been eroded by because of inflation soaring out of control under this UK government. It would still leave us with the £700 million that we have had to allocate unbudgeted for higher pay deals because of the soaring inflation being presided over by this UK government. So we'll continue to take the hard decisions to get support to where it is needed most. Of course, one of the pressures on all construction projects right now is inflation, which this UK government is failing to get under control. But we will continue to focus on making sure the ferries now are completed on the revised budget and on the revised timeline.
Douglas Ross.
Oh yes. Well done. Well done. Muted applause here because, of course, the First Minister did her usual thing to blame Westminster for everything, but not actually address the question that I put.
Mr. Ross, I will not have members shouting at one another from a sedentary position. Please just resist the temptation. Mr. Ross.
Well, I hope the Deputy First Minister does resist that temptation, although he seems to do it quite a lot, because he doesn't want to hear what members are saying. The First Minister's answer was all about what the UK Government have done wrong, nothing about what CMAL are saying about these ships may never enter service. All that money, hundreds of millions of pounds that could be wasted. And today, the First Minister's former right-hand man, the disgraced Derek Mackay, appeared before a Scottish Parliament committee to discuss the ferry scandal. A scandal that has hit Scottish public finances and where we still don't know why the government made the disastrous call they did. At the Public Audit Committee today, the ex-Finance Minister outlined what he believes went wrong with these contracts before we understand he was smuggled out of this building by Parliament officials. So does the First Minister agree with all of the evidence that Derek Mackay gave today?
First Minister.
I have not had the opportunity to look at all of the evidence that Derek Mackay gave to the committee. I'm sure I will take the opportunity to do that as soon as I'm able to, and then Douglas Ross, I'm sure, will come back and ask me more about this. But Douglas Ross keeps quoting CMAL and saying that CMAL's view is that the ferries will never be in service. So let me quote the Chief Executive of CMAL, Kevin Hobbs, just in June, and I'm quoting directly here. There is not much now which is standing in the way of both of them being delivered. There are a lot of detractors out there saying rather spurious things about them, but we've always had a view that both would be finished. Now, I wouldn't suggest that the detractors out there saying rather spurious things was a reference to Douglas Ross. Others, of course, may reach that conclusion.
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Like it, but CMAL have said that the number and the severity of faults may lead to the fact that these ships never sail. So if the First Minister doesn't want to hear it, that's fine, but that's coming from CMAL. But it seems she doesn't like to hear a lot of things. It's amazing, just amazing, how often Nicola Sturgeon has never seen or never heard anything that is potentially a difficult question. But we know there was significant evidence given by Derek Mackay today. But during the First Minister's recent run at the Edinburgh Fringe, she said the disastrous ferry contracts weren't a scandal. Well, this is where we saw the First Minister during the summer, and she said the ferry contracts weren't a scandal. Her words at the Edinburgh Fringe were, well, I'll wait for the SNP to be quiet, because I think it's important everyone hears this. The First Minister's words were, this has not been a scandal with the ferries. It's a situation. A situation. £250 million up in smoke, nothing to show for it. If that's not a scandal, I don't know what is. But today, even disgraced Derek Mackay accepted that the purchase of these ferries was catastrophic, That's the bit maybe Nicola Sturgeon didn't see today. Her former loyal lieutenant admitting how awful this mistake was, even though it further ruins his already trashed reputation. So why can't Nicola Sturgeon admit that this is a downright scandal that is taking hundreds of millions of pounds away from tackling the cost of living crisis that we are facing here in Scotland right now?
First Minister.
Firstly, I'm happy to answer any questions on this. I've answered many questions on this and I've made my views very clear on this. But Douglas Ross doesn't like it when he quotes CMAL, and I quote the Chief Executive saying the exact opposite. So perhaps he should be less selective in that. But on the wider issues, Douglas Ross has stood up here, and I think it is quite staggering, and says there's nothing to show for the investment in Ferguson's shipyard. I don't know about a Conservative, but I think almost 400 jobs does not equate to nothing to show. We value people's jobs, and we take action wherever we can to protect people's jobs, and that is perhaps the difference between this government and the Conservatives. We'll continue to focus on the job at hand. That is what people expect of us, and I will happily answer any questions for as long as Douglas Ross wants to ask questions on this issue. But I suspect Douglas Ross's choice of topic today is more a reflection on his own difficulties than anything else. After all, it's not me that started this new parliamentary term with one MSP standing down from his front bench and another MSP quitting Parliament altogether, so perhaps he's not got his own troubles to seek.